Welcome back to the Student Hub Live. Well, that was a really interesting session talking about things that we can do to really nourish good mental health, in particular over the winter months. And I must say, one of the things I particularly like doing in winter is curling up with a good book. So to talk about our next area, we're going to look at women writers, and I'm joined by Fiona Doolin and Sue Asbee. Now, Fiona and Sue have been working on a new module, A355, and they'll talk a little bit about that later. But Fiona is a senior lecturer in English, and you've just seen her video if you're watching live. Now, Fiona's been working on narrative forms of storytelling and development in contemporary fiction for a long time, and she's here to discuss her contribution to the Women Writers' Voices and Transitions series that we're going to be showing you throughout the evening, and to talk also about inspirational writers. And Sue's a senior lecturer in English and is currently chair of A230, which is a second year module, reading and studying literature. Now, you've written a chapter on Frankenstein by Mary Shelley for that module, so particularly relevant, and also you've been editing the 20th century book on the module and writing a chapter on the American poets of the Harlem Renaissance, and also writing on Virginia Woolf's last novel. I mean, you have been incredibly busy, Sue, so I think we should really be doing something on time management here. But clearly there are some women writers in particular who've really inspired you, and I know for students often studying things and reading them, they have these inspirational relationships between texts and things that then go on to change their lives. So we're going to talk really about some of the lives of these writers and how they've really shifted, I guess, something in you that's really encouraged you to go into quite a lot of detail about their lives and works.
Well, maybe I can start by talking about Jeanette Winterson, since you've mentioned the little film that I was involved in making on her work. I think I first began reading Winterson when I was in my 20s, and I went from one novel to the next. And I think she inspired me for a number of different reasons, partly because she was a kind of role model, and partly because she was still is an exciting experimental writer. So in terms of her life, she kind of set her sights on becoming a writer, on going to Oxford, having come from a kind of working class background. She was able to achieve her aspirations, and her writing really gripped me. I remember sitting in a flat in Buckingham and just zipping through novel after novel. So that's one of the inspirations in terms of Winterson's work.
So many people, I think, find an author. I'm like that at the moment. I've just pre-ordered a book by my favourite author that's due in April, I think, and I'm sitting there waiting, thinking, should I have this on pre-order or might I get an early copy in the shop? And there's this disappointment, I guess, when it finishes, because you can really get hooked. Who have you been hooked by, Sue, most? What's your sort of memory of that sort of insatiable desire to read a whole work?
Well, it's a tricky one, really, because there are quite a few. My experience is a bit different from Fiona's, because she wrote on Jeanette Winterson for this Level 3 literature module. I wrote on Virginia Woolf's novel Between the Acts, and I first read Virginia Woolf as an undergraduate, and I found her impossible. I'd been brought up on 19th century novels which have a story and a plot, and lots of characters and things happen over a long period of time. And my experience of first reading Woolf wasn't a bit like that, and it was just a surprise. And I think one of the things I learned from that, which is really handy as a student, is to think why you find something difficult. And if you find it difficult, do some work on it, because you may still not like it very much when you're finished, but you'll have found it interesting. And that's what Woolf did for me. I've spent my life writing and thinking about Woolf. I'm not sure I still read her for fun, but I really loved writing on Between the Acts. It's her last novel. It's a short novel, and yet it takes the span of the time is about 24 hours, but she packs in prehistory, all the characters think about their pasts, their childhood. And I think the other thing is people tend to think of Woolf as kind of upper class. One of the things I love about Between the Acts is it begins with characters talking about the new cesspool. Down to earth. You don't get much more down to earth than that. There's more I can say about it, but let's carry on with it.
Well, let's see. We'd asked people at home what stories and books have inspired them. And again, you know, really sort of resonating here with people about those sort of moments where you get these inspirational writers. Let's see what people said. Swiss Family Robinson, Margaret Atwood, yeah, one of my favourites, Ursula Le Guin, Enid Blyton and John Green. So some lovely ideas there about authors that I have inspired. And again, really authors as opposed to stories, which is interesting when given the choice. So maybe that's because we're talking very much about authors as opposed to the stories. Perhaps it's that. But, you know, what do you think? Is it more an author or story
I think it's a bit
element?
of both. In terms of Winterson, just to go back to Oranges, on which I wrote for A335, in some ways it's an old story. It's a story of growing up, coming out, going to university, trying to overcome lots of obstacles. But there are aspects of the way that the story is told, the humour with which the story is related, the connections with fairy tales, the lovely relationship, rather conflicted relationship with the mother, Mrs. Winterson, the background, the religious background, the absence, in a way, of the father. So it's an old story. It's a story of growing up, going through painful moments, discovering one's sexuality, having to fight for what one is looking for. So this story goes back a long time. It's a story to which we can all relate, but the way Winterson narrates the story in relation to books of the Bible, starting at Genesis and moving to Ruth, is experimental, it's novel, it grips you. And I think we can't underestimate the humour with which it's told. So it's a kind of tragicomic novel in many ways, semi-autobiographical. Some of the episodes are revisited in Winterson's memoir. So that's always interesting to look at, how Winterson here writes about some of the same scenes, but presents them slightly differently when she's working within the context of a memoir rather than a semi-autobiographical novel.
And I think that Jeanette Winterson was very interested in Virginia Woolf, wasn't she?
She certainly was. In fact, another of her novels, Sexing the Cherry, in 1989, draws very much on Woolf, and indeed one of Woolf's novels, Orlando, because it's a novel that is set in two different time frames and has characters who reappear across time. So yes, and in fact another of my favourite writers, Ali Smith, is another big fan of Virginia Woolf. So that's the other very interesting thing. Once you start to get interested in particular writers, you realise that they have started from somewhere, that they've had an enthusiasm about particular
and
writers.
And influence as well.
Exactly, and they've learnt things from them.
And they're readers too.
And they're readers too,
In
exactly.
fact, I don't think you can be a writer without being a reader.
The most interesting thing is you're so passionate about these writers, and what's evident is that it's partly the story, very much the way that they're telling the story, but you're also looking at these pieces of literature from very different angles, and it's very clear that you're doing that. Tell me, how do you get to take these pieces of enthusiasm and passion and different takes on things and put them into modules? How do you decide? Can you just go, no, I mean, I can imagine you're planning meetings with who's going in and who's not, but how do you sort of take some of these aspects, and how do you, between you, construct a module that's sort of looking at these various things with saying, well, so-and-so is best for showing X, Y or Z? You know, there's this element of both, you know, the authors, the stories and the craft. How do you balance all of that?
I think Woolf has earned her place because she's a major figure. I think we mostly think of Woolf's big 1920s works have, as a modernist, Mrs. Dalloway and To the Lighthouse, I think, are probably the most well-known of her novels. She wrote 9, and I'm particularly fond of Between the Acts because it hasn't had quite as much attention as those early ones. So it belongs, and one of the things, of course, to think about is the title itself, Between the Acts. The novel is about putting on the village pageant. This is an annual event. It happens every year. Every year people say, is it going to rain? Will it shine? There's a kind of rhythm and rhyme to these annual events. And I've lost my thread. What was I talking about?
The reasons that we choose particular works to write on.
And I was talking about the title, Between the Acts. So part of it is looking at what happens between the acts of the pageant, the audience participation. The audience are just as interesting as what's going on the open air at stage. But the other thing, of course, is between the acts of the First World War and the Second World War. So it's absolutely poised. She started writing it in about 1937, 38. I think it came out in, 41. It came out during the Second World War. So there are different ways of looking at the title. It means different things. It's full of suggestion. So she's great for that particular slot in that particular module, right there, Second World War novel.
I think your question's a very interesting one because, as you can imagine, there is quite a lot of discussion that takes place in module team meetings. And sometimes it's a kind of organic process. So in the case of the Level 3 Literature module, Literature in Transition, 1800 to the present, we had a sense that we wanted to have 3 books that would correspond to particular movements and moments, and we'd look in particular at the writers who were doing something to shake things up in many cases, or writers who were kind of emblematic of a particular movement, realism, for example. So I suppose in the context of this module, in writing about Winterson, I had a backward glance and a forward glance. A backward glance in the sense that although Winterson is a contemporary writer, she's alive today, alive and kicking, she's very much someone who looked back to Woolf and has written at length about Woolf and other modernist writers and how they shaped the way in which she approaches the novel form, and gave her the courage, I suppose, to be as experimental as she is. At the same time, she's someone who's writing at a different time, in a different age, and so she's looking for what Woolf was looking for at a different moment, new forms for new times. So writers look back to the past in many ways for inspiration, to understand the kind of shape that the novel takes at particular moments, and then they use that as a kind of springboard to look forward. I mentioned Ellie Smith, who is one of the writers who's going to be included in a new Level 2 module that we're in the process of thinking about, and we really are at the early stages of this, a module called Telling Stories, the Novel and Beyond. And there's an interesting connection, really, between Ali Smith and Jeanette Winterson, because Ali Smith and Winterson have grown up at the same time, within a few years of one another. Winterson has interviewed Ali Smith. She has written about her work. So she has, on Hotel World, for example, she has got a review at the back. And she, in essence, is kind of authorising or inviting the public to read Ali Smith and saying that this is a writer to look out for. So I think going back to the idea of the process and how we come to determine which writers are in, which writers are out, I think we think about what it is we're trying to do in each module. but we also think about having, to a certain extent, a representative sample of writers. So we are talking today about women writers, and one of the aspects of our discussion is always about, have we got a kind of gender balance? Have we got writers of different ethnicities
That's right,
in
yes.
our module? Have we got writers who are shaping literature into the future, as well as writers who have shaped the past?
Thinking of this idea about situatedness, you know, about positioning things from a given time and place, you two are clearly experts and very passionate about certain authors. And I wondered about that sort of, how that sort of played off. You know, is it useful sometimes to write about somebody you don't know, to get that critical stance on something where you are approaching it from a position of maybe not loving that author so much? I mean, has that helped you with Woolf, distancing yourself and maybe sort of seeing it as craft as opposed to something that you're very emotionally connected with?
That's a really interesting question. The first thing I ever wrote for Open University teaching material was on a novelist I had never heard of called Kate Chopin. She was American, Louisiana. Her novel, The Awakening, came out in 1899. And actually, it was a brilliant way to write what in those couple of chapters on, because I knew nothing. I was approaching it from exactly the same position as any student who had never heard of her would. So I like to think that I was asking myself the same kind of questions that anyone who was reading Kate Chopin for the first time would want answers to. Surprisingly enough, I'm in the same position for A335, the module that Fiona's writing about, Ali Smith. I'm writing about another American woman writer called Edith Wharton. And this is to my shame that I've never really read much Edith Wharton, but I've just started work on a novel of hers that came out in 1913 called The Custom of the Country. Wonderful. Why have I never read Edith Wharton before? But yeah, I shall read an awful lot more now. And again, it's coming in, actually, you know, I know nothing about this. How do I find out what's most interesting? And then just taking the novel to pieces and putting it back together again.
We asked our audience which books had changed their life, and I'd like to see what they have to say about some of these stories that have really had an impact. So The Book Thief, Handmaid's Tale, Road to Freedom, Why Mummy Drinks, The Bible. Gosh, there's a massive range here, from Harry Potter, Swiss Family Robinson, I can't see, the To Kill a Mockingbird, classic. So lots and lots of very interesting ideas that have clearly had, you know, a huge impact. 50 Shades of Grey. Again, some more literary than others. So there's this idea then that I guess, you know, things are sort of shifting in us, and we're relating to books. But I wonder if you can talk a little bit about studying literature, because clearly there's more to it than just the reading. And you're sort of, I guess, having these lenses, these different frameworks, these different interpretations, these narratives on narratives about things. How is literature a skill that's useful for students above and beyond just loving books? How do students learn something from maybe a book that they don't immediately love, or one that's really hard to get through?
I think one of the things that literature can teach students is close reading skills. Now, of course, if you have enthusiasm for what you're reading, it can make life easier. However, as Sue was saying, we don't always read things that we in advance know we're going to like. We have to sometimes plough through things, and maybe at the end of that process of ploughing through things, we actually discover in the process an interest in the writing, an interest in the topic. We make connections between things going on in our own lives and character situations within the world of the novel. So from that perspective as well, students can learn a little bit of discipline. They can learn, I suppose, to give something some time. Sometimes you'll start something and it won't grab you immediately, although many novels or novelists work quite hard at the openings of their novel precisely to try to hook the reader. And it's interesting, and students may want to have a look at this, just pick some novels at random and have a look at the first line or the first paragraph and see how that works and what makes for them a good entree into the topic and what doesn't seem to work. But if you're having difficulty getting through a novel, sometimes you can stick with it and then go back over it. So in terms of the kinds of skills of analysis, you can go back over things, look at perhaps how a character is presented, who is presenting the character. Is the character telling his or her own story? Is it told from the perspective of someone else or in the voice of someone else? What difference does that make if you get to tell your own story or if someone tells your story for you? So from that point of view, it can also make us think as readers and listeners about the stories out there in the world. Who gets to tell the stories? What stories are not told? So there's a relationship between our everyday lives and what is happening in the world of the novel and how stories are told, who by, for whom, with what purpose, for what effect.
One of the things I loved about what you were saying, in particular, Sue, when you were sort of setting the scene, is just thinking back again to when I studied English literature. And one of the things I used to love was this introduction, this idea of someone presenting almost what you were going to read. It's no longer just a book. It's no longer just something. It's something embedded within some context or something else. And I guess with studying literature, you get to look at those frameworks. It's almost like, let's pay attention to this, let's pay attention to that. And it sounds like the way that you're combining the sort of context, the craft, the various combinations of things. It's about giving people those different lenses so that the works are not just works on their own. There's something in a context of something a lot more meaningful.
I think that's exactly right. And the opening of Between the Acts actually gives you so many... First time you read it, here are some middle-aged people sitting around in a country house talking about the cesspool and the county council's failure to provide a water supply. You know, you don't get much more.
Not a grand opening. A gripping opening.
It's not a gripping opening. And yet, when you've finished reading it and you start thinking about it and you reread that opening section, you see that she's set everything up there that she's about to talk about. She's talking about history, movement of time. This is what it's like now. This is what it ought to be like in the future. One of the people who's talking is a retired somebody who'd been in the colonial, he'd been in the Indian service. Well, there's a whole vista of British colonial history summed up in this retired gentleman who's back in his own, time and the movement of time and the passage of time is just, and bet you don't even notice it. And actually that's why you really need the close reading that Fiona was talking about, because you read to see what's happening and then you read to see, gosh, this is art. It's so beautifully put together. Everything's being set up. Old Mrs. Swithin is reading about prehistory. And her mind is wandering off and she's thinking about dinosaurs roaming round Piccadilly. And it's all in the present moment. As these people sit round, somebody's thinking about their childhood, but in a matter of a page, half a page, everything's set up. First time you read, you don't notice. You've got to read and reread. And suddenly you see that this isn't just telling you what's happened. Her prose has got a rhythm, and it's got a rhythm. It's got rhyme sometimes. She's just doing fascinating things with it.
Oh, well, we're out of time for our session, and as many things, you know, the film version is never as good as reading a book itself, but you've really, I think, shown some wonderful ideas about how English literature is studied at the OU and the benefits of studying English literature, and also some of the things that have inspired you and why sometimes it's good to stick with something that maybe you're not drawn to in the first place. That's been really, really wonderful. Thank you so much, Sue and Fiona, for coming along today.
Thank you, Karen.
Well, we're going to look at Sue's video now, which is about Virginia Woolf, and then we're going to be talking to Religious Studies about restraint and celebration. So join us in a few minutes for that next session. We'll see you soon.